Welcome back to Rethinking Freedom. Whether you are watching this before the show we had this morning on the new Scramble for Africa and why you should care, or whether you have watched that show first and now you're catching this, I just want to thank you for being here. There were some things that we mentioned during the show and that I wanted to build upon in just a few minutes here, and just to also share some of the books that we referenced during that show. So first thing I would say is the show was on the new Scramble for Africa and why you should care. And if you're someone who's saying, I don't really know much about Africa, or perhaps I should ask you the question, how much do you really know about Africa and what's your source? I would definitely recommend you get a copy of the book by one of the guests that we had this morning, Adesoji Iginla. And that book is called Africa Illuminated, and you can get it wherever books are sold, certainly on Amazon, which I prefer to get my books from Black bookstores, but as an author, I also understand the importance of being on Amazon as well. But Africa Illuminated is a very short book. I was looking for my copy, but I think I took my copy to Nigeria, to the library that we have there. But it's a fairly compact book that goes through all the countries that make up the continent of Africa, so that you get an understanding of the diversity of that continent, and the peoples and the commonalities and the differences and the foods and even landmarks. So that's a great book as an entry point to, I want to know more about Africa, to increase your curiosity about the place. So the major question was, why should you care about the Scramble of Africa? Well, if you're a person of African descent, whether it's 1 drop or 10 drops, whatever your makeup is, first of all, understand that the events that led up to the Scramble of Africa is the reason why we are, one of the main reasons why we are dispersed in the way that we are across the world. Of course, we know that African people, that life began on the African continent and African people migrated, and there are books that will explain to you how people changed in terms of how they look over time. So ultimately, we know that Africa is the cradle of civilization. We should know that Africa is the cradle for science, is the cradle for mathematics, is the cradle for writing, is the cradle for language, is the cradle for art, is the cradle for spirituality, is the cradle for a concept of God. And if you have any questions and you can't find answers yourself, send me a message and I will actually get you more information. I can also direct you to scholars who are really rooted in this work, who can expand your understanding of things. But I wanted to just point out a few things. First of all, one of the books that was referenced during the show earlier today is a book by a man that I will forever hold in high esteem, John Henry Clark. This one happens to be an autographed copy that I got when I worked for him. It's called Who Betrayed the African World Revolution? John Henry Clark. Who Betrayed the African World Revolution and Other Speeches. Fairly easy to get a copy of this. A couple of other books that you might want to think about as we're talking about what is the connection. Why should we care what's happening in Africa, besides the fact that what happened in Africa is what has brought us to this place? That scramble, that need to take our labor, our physical labor, our actual bodies, and now increasingly, it always has been, but also increasingly, all of the goods, all of the minerals that are in Africa, all of it plays a role, right? The reason why there's so much disinformation about the continent that is fed to those of us who are here, and information about those of us who are here that's fed to people on the continent, that keeps us divided. And you all have heard about this concept of divide and conquer. So as long as they see themselves as different, as long as even on the continent, people are seeing themselves as Nigerian and Ghanaian and Togolese and South African, as opposed to understanding we really come from different ethnic backgrounds, but we're ultimately one people. And so my people are the Ijaw. And there's a book that was written by Professor Alagwa, The Izon of the Delta, basically tracking that we originated from the area now known as Kemet, Egypt, right? And so there are migrations that take place, but there are also commonalities. But we have now bought into this notion of divisions based on lines arbitrarily drawn by other people that make it impossible, or definitely much more difficult and expensive, to travel within our continent, to trade with one another, to exchange ideas and information. And what that does is it keeps us isolated and easy to conquer. So when I was in Europe earlier this year, you can get on a fast train and you're in one country and in the other country and all of that, and you've got your EU passport, and that's all that it takes. But in Africa, it's not that way. And why is it that way? Okay. So some of the books that you might want to think about, Chinwe Zu's The West and the Rest of Us. And the title is The West and the Rest of Us: White Predators, Black Slavers, and the African Elite. Really helps us kind of take a look at what happened, what is still happening, how do we combat it? Because you cannot solve an issue that you have not even named yet, that you've not even really identified. If you're still buying into the disinformation about Africa is poor, why are you all there? Why are your multinational corporations there? Why won't you leave us alone? Why does America have so many bases on the continent of Africa? Then just leave us alone and let's figure it out ourselves, right? But no, you don't do that. A book that was mentioned during the show, Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask. Of course, he's also the author of The Wretched of the Earth, so that might be a book you want to look at. My 14, well, now 15-year-old, but when he was 14, he read this book over the summer, Africa's Agitators, Militant and Colonialism in Africa. Hold on, let me wear my glasses so I make sure I'm reading this correctly. Yeah, Militant and Anti-colonialism in Africa and the West, 1918 through 1939. So again, getting a basic understanding of what worked, what didn't work. Here's another book by a gentleman that I got to meet, an absolute amazing historian and teacher, Vincent Thompson, and it's The Making of the African Diaspora in the Americas, 1441 to 1900. Important for us to understand how we're interconnected and to understand how those connections still determine our outcomes here as Black people wherever we are in the world, which is why you see CARICOM and leaders like Mia Motley calling for us to come together and work together. So one quick example, some of you may know the names Kwame Nkrumah, first president of Ghana after it, quote unquote, got its independence, and Nnamdi Azikiwe. These were actually men, Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, who's the first prime minister in Nigeria. These are actually men who studied here in the United States of America at historically Black colleges, met with other like-minded individuals, Black people across the diaspora, in Harlem, in other places, and we're formulating their ideas of liberation and freedom. And they went back to their places on the continent, and we're actually part of major movements that brought about independence. But understand that the explosion of quote unquote independence of African nations happened in the 1960s, right? Ghana started in 1957. And then what do you see happening in the United States of America? You see the civil rights movement, 1950s through the 1960s. If we talk about the quote unquote end of apartheid, or apartheid, however you say it, in South Africa, you see the role that African Americans played in pressuring this country and other countries to basically divest from South Africa and not to be supportive of that regime. And so our histories and our successes, and quite frankly, our defeats are very much intertwined. When we get to a part where African people across the diaspora, whether you are in Southern America or Northern America, whether you are in Asia, whether you are on the continent or the so-called Middle East, and I always ask myself, middle of what East? Like, was that not a part of Africa? But hey, the conversation for another day. Wherever you find yourself, when we understand that we are one people and that our destinies are intertwined, we could change the world. We could absolutely change the world and make it a better place for everybody, not make it continue to be about this um, capitalism that feeds on people and that only thrives when the vast majority of people actually are suffering. So I'm going to end with just mentioning a few more books for those of you who are like, where do I start? Start with re-educating yourself. How about that? This is a book published by the Black Classic Press, but it was put out by the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which was founded by Carter G. Woodson. You may know him as the father of Negro History Week, now Black History Month. But this book is called African Heroes and Heroines, and they go through extensively, quite through some of the heroes and heroines of Africa. Why? Because they understand the importance of us knowing our history. That when they say, oh, we brought slaves here, no, you brought human beings here whom you enslaved. That's very different. So when people are saying, oh, I'm a descendant of a slave, no. You're a descendant of a human being who was enslaved. Two very different things. You need to understand who these people were and what they were about. And so contents of this book, they go through the African natives and their early visitors. They talk about heroes who are, more Islamicized, if you will. They're Muslim. They talk about Ashanti and Dahomey. They talk about the conflict in South Africa, Chaka in East Africa, and so on and so forth. A lot of good information in here. These are two by George Aite. This one is Africa in Chaos, but he also wrote a book that I think is very helpful at this point for us to read and understand, which is Africa Unchained, the Blueprint for Africa's Future. And it's really interesting because this book was published back in 2005, so we're 19 years into it. And now looking at what is going on in many of the Francophone countries, as we mentioned, the Francophone, the countries in Africa. So these are countries that were colonized by France and how they're pushing back at this time. Very informative. And then for you women as well, and for everybody else. But as we look at what has just happened in the United States of America with Kamala Harris and some people feeling, we don't want another Black president, but more importantly, not a Black female president. Here is a book by Ife Amadiume called African Possibilities. And she goes on to say, a matriarchalitarian perspective for social justice. So for those of you who are looking for some answers, what do we do? Where do we go from here? This was published in 2024, so this year. But looking at prophecy, authenticity, oppositional models of resistance in Africa, we don't have to reinvent the wheel in terms of our resistance. We do need to learn from what we did in the past, what worked, what didn't work, why it didn't work, and how we learn those lessons and move forward. So again, if you're just catching this, you want to go and watch the full show. And that was episode 8 of Rethinking Freedom, the new Scramble for Africa and why you should care. And if you had already watched that and now you're watching this, thank you so much. Please like, please share, please subscribe. Our goal is to be part of helping all of us rethink what freedom is, so that we can actually start to make different decisions, different choices that bring about that freedom in real time for us and certainly for those yet to come. Thank you so much for joining Rethinking Freedom. I'm your host, Aya Fabaranelli.